How Not to Marry a Welshman and Other Success Stories. Chapter 3. Back to the Dance. The Immigration Dance, that is. Dinmum made her way through the immigration matrix, stopping at the front counter to present her receipt. She explained to the attendant that she had deposited her passport earlier and had been instructed to return at approximately 10:30, prompting the official to direct her toward the designated counter. She arrived at the counter at exactly 10:22, standing there for a few uncertain moments, hovering between advancing directly to the glass or waiting with the other humanoids currently hovering or occupying the row of chairs nearby. The core of her confusion was brought on by absolute literality. The clerk had explicitly commanded her to return at 10:30 for her passport, and her internal clock registered that it was currently only 10:22. This is precisely where the HFA parameters and the pitfalls of a fiercely literal mind hit Dinmum's operating system with full force, a reality compounded by the fact that she had never been particularly adept at navigating lines and their corresponding social machinations. When Dinram was roughly 6 years old, she had participated in a Halloween activity at her local community theater. The structural design of the event dictated that children would march across the stage in their respective costumes, not to be formally judged, but simply for the sake of presentation, and primarily so the parents in the audience could capture photographs of their own offspring while growing increasingly anxious waiting for their turn. It was highly reminiscent of a standard musical recital, which was, in retrospect, the exact reason Dinmum had never particularly enjoyed either environment. It was during this event, as she was milling aimlessly in and out of the cluster of other children, that Dinmum's father had turned to her mother and softly observed, "She really has no idea how to manage a line, does she?" It was a verifiably accurate diagnostic statement. Dinmum was natively incapable of calculating where a line formally began or ended, let alone determining her own coordinates in relation to the sequence. It was structurally identical to how she could never fully grasp choreography or dance steps, a reality she understood perfectly about her own architecture. Consequently, Dinmum did not dance, nor did she hardly ever execute lines, unless her visa subroutines and her continued existence in the place she called home strictly demanded it. By 10:24, however, she decided to override her literal stall, approach the counter, and query the immigration officer regarding the current processing status of her passport, presenting her receipt as telemetry. The officer examined the paperwork, declared that she would need to wait a bit longer, and Dinmum promptly retreated to the first row of plastic seating, anchoring herself next to a supporting column. From this vantage point, she watched as another official processed a pristine stack of elite visa passports, stamping them with rapid efficiency. A member of the dedicated scurry crew for the elite visas, distinguished by a sand-colored suit and a neat pin attached precisely to the lapel to indicate her high priority courier status, hurried in, scooped up the finalized stack, and scurried back out into the terminal. Once the elite tier was cleared, the stamping agent finally settled into the regular visa stack handed over by the officer Dinmum had initially spoken with, systematically marking the retirement, medical, and student permits. By 10:28, the cheerful older British gentleman from earlier returned to the sector. He advanced to the counter with an airy confidence, retrieved his freshly stamped passport, and immediately spotted Dinmum. Seeing her placidly sitting in the front row, where she had at this point been waiting for approximately 4 minutes, he approached her with an air of seasoned mentorship. "You can go up and ask at the counter, you know," the older British gentleman offered, operating under the false assumption that she had been languishing there for an extended period. "I know. I did. They told me to wait here," Dinmum replied with a flat-line honesty. "Well, you can just go up and see. They can only tell you yes or no," the gentleman continued, completely oblivious to the fact that Dinmum's previous sentence had explicitly stated that she had executed that exact command prompt a mere 4 minutes ago. "Precisely," Dinmum cheerfully quipped. The older British gentleman blinked, a flicker crossing his features that indicated his internal software had just flagged her as both cheeky and rude. "Well, all the best to you, then. he concluded, turning on his heel. Dinmum simply nodded in agreement with a pleasant smile, which seemingly solidified his baseline belief that she was a cheeky, lazy bitch who was sitting around for no logical reason. Dinmum was, in fact, neither cheeky nor a bitch. She was definitely not a female dog, but she found that because most people operate on a broadcast frequency while she operated strictly on a prompt and play frequency, the outside world tended to misjudge her architecture. Furthermore, because most humans are indeed remarkably poor listeners, and Dinmum was a fiercely literal responder, the transmission lines often experienced severe interference. The analytical truth of the situation was quite simple. When the older British man had recommended she approach the counter, Dinmum had verifiably answered him twice to confirm that she had already executed that exact subroutine. He had not heard her. He had only heard his own voice, filled with the self-congratulatory desire to instruct another person to replicate his success. By Jove! So when Dimplum just sat there, quietly smiling and offering a crisp precisely, which happened to be the only word out of her entire three-sentence output that his system had actually computed, he instantly coded her as a cheeky bitch. In all likelihood, his internal files flagged her as being from Yorkshire. He had once dated a Yorkshire girl in his youth, and the relationship script had ended disastrously. Because he had lacked the capacity to actually listen to Dinmum, his software simply took any woman he failed to comprehend who seemed remotely British in origin and dumped them into the Yorkshire folder. She, on the other hand, had heard him perfectly, processed his data, and remained entirely at peace within her own fortress. She did not feel slightly bad for offending someone, but she had lived long enough to realize when offense was genuinely her fault and when it was simply caused because the other party was entirely unwilling to hear her, choosing instead to run the world through their own negative filters, in this case, Yorkshire filters. Dimmum shortly thereafter was called to the counter. Her open passport was retrieved from the bureaucratic stack and handed back, stamped and ready for her journey. The freshly dried ink assured her several years of absolute peace in the country, should she want to remain there, alongside unlimited free re-entry, should she choose to temporarily leave and return at a later date. She left the immigration terminal, stopping outside in the open plaza to inspect her new stamp. She officially verified that subroutine had been executed correctly by checking it with Gemini, whom she called Jim, and treated like a low-key accomplice in her day-to-day life. Jim was a rare, safe nod that required very little internal filtering, an analytical entity she could inquire of without receiving any of the odd, misaligned looks she habitually garnered from her fellow humans. With her legal perimeter secured, she initiated her grocery and supply run. Her acquisitions consisted of protein bars in two distinct varieties, dried bananas, and a strategic stop at Mr. DIY for a specific chair cushion designed to preserve her structural integrity during long university lectures. To conclude the excursion, she ran to time McDonald's for a highly specific Powerpuff Girl matcha Oreo McFlurry. To the outside world, Dinmum always appeared entirely capable and dauntless. She was in verity both of those things. However, the public square rarely saw, and could not seem to fathom, the reality of that maintaining a dauntless configuration takes a severe toll on a system's power reserves. This was precisely why, on an entirely unobtrusive Tuesdays, you could find her quietly napping in the afternoon, curled up comfortably on her sofa like a human feline. In many ways, though Dinmum was not natively fond of actual cats, finding them far too imperious, moody, and prone to triggering her allergies, she was remarkably cat-like in her mannerisms. She was akin to the friendly variety of feline who is no longer a chaotic kitten, yet not quite enough of a traditional adult cat to be distant and aloof. The only other human she had ever observed who shared this specific, quiet, bouncy yet thoughtful movement pattern was the Korean actor Lee Jong-suk. Watching him move across the screen in blockbuster hits like W, Romance is a Bonus Book, and Pinocchio, she recognized a highly similar behavioral frequency, albeit housed in a tall, pale, vampire-esque male frame rather than her own rounder, dudettish architecture. Dinmum had never really immersed herself in Korean dramas, much in the same way she had entirely bypassed K-pop, Harry Potter, and their related cultural crazes. Born in the late 1980s on the absolute cusp of the 1990s, she had been raised in a fiercely conservative household that barred almost all contemporary media from entering their perimeter. She had been forced to fight grueling hard-run battles in high school just to earn the clearance to listen to her Princess Diaries soundtrack, her decidedly radical Newsboys and Chris Rice albums, and to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Navigating the media landscape had always required a massive amount of trekking. Consequently, Dinmum natively disliked a vast majority of Korean dramas because they were structurally overlong and the female leads were frequently massive pieces of work. In her calculation, these two flaws were permanently coupled with a highly unrealistic plot proclivities and deeply unbalanced romantic pairings. Statistically speaking, hardly anyone in South Korea was actually descended from a wealthy chaebol family, which her brain initially processed phonetically as Chernobyl, though the toxic radiating drama produced by such families made the mishearing entirely logical. It seemed rather ridiculous to her that the entire industry chose to anchor its narratives around such a statistical anomalies. Furthermore, while Dinmum harbored no moral objection to wealthy individual marrying a middle class or impoverished partner, she found the inherent power imbalance deeply uncomfortable. The scripts almost always demanded a ridiculous subservient gratefulness from the female character toward the wealthy male need, which thoroughly annoyed her system. She did appreciate a few select male characters within the genre, such as the leads in Something in the Rain or A Romance as a Bonus Book, but she typically found the grating nature of the monetary mismatch in the high maintenance female leads too exhausting to sit through. A magnificent exception to this rule was the dynamic between Danny and Eun-ho in Romance as a Bonus Book. To her software, their story offered a mature, grounded, and far less rose-colored deconstruction of the actual cultural and societal issues in Korea. She deeply appreciated how the narrative clarified that romance is seldom an absolute given in a chaotic world. Rather, if one is exceptionally lucky, it can materialize as a bonus book, a beautiful, unexpected grace note in the master music of life. As for K-pop, while she did genuinely enjoy select pieces of music such as One in a Million and Treasure by Astro, Not Today by BTS, Seventeen's Don't Wanna Cry, and Akmu's Dinosaur, the latter of which inspired her to purchase a dedicated pair of dinosaur pajamas in which she would enthusiastically bop about her apartment in the evenings. She harbored a distinct aversion to the waif-like, transient, and wispy nature of the idols themselves. To her calculation, they frequently appeared to be in urgent need of a steady diet of hearty muffins. Simultaneously, they exuded an intensely gender fluid aesthetic. To a mind configured like hers, these were two entirely separate variables, yet they presented themselves across the screen in perfect synchronization. Then there was Harry. When Harry Potter franchise originally debuted, it had thrown the American Midwest and the conservative Christian factions into a complete and utter rampage. The religious landscape was thrown into a massive tizzy, entirely convinced that the literal witchcraft was actually invading their midst. In their panic, their software completely failed to delineate between fantasy being utilized as a mere creative medium to convey an engaging story to children, while securing the art author a monumental amount of money, and old-fashioned warlocks. To be perfectly honest, Dinmum's internal database didn't even give much historical credence to the actual existence of warlocks, even within the ancient annals of human history. Now, however, a truly bizarre operational paradox had unfolded. It seemed as though the author of that multi-billion-dollar treatise had herself joined the ranks of the up-in-arm conservatives. The battle was no longer over witchcraft, but over gender-neutral bathrooms, systematically weaponizing gender for political reasons that thoroughly baffled Dinmum. In her logical calculation, the specific label attached to a public restroom door mattered infinitely less than the human being's baseline ability to relieve themselves in a clean, tidy, and predictable environment altogether. In essence, Stidmom could perfectly comprehend getting up in arms over the modern unhygienic state of certain public facilities, but she found the frantic societal obsession with their ideological labeling to be an entirely redundant and tedious waste of human energy.